behalf of festival co-directors Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome back to JLF's Brave New World. Those of you who missed any of our earlier sessions featuring some of the best writers and thinkers of our times, including Margaret Atwood, Oran Pamuk, Elizabeth Gilbert, Benjamin Moser, Rupi Kaur, Peter Frankopan, Meera Nair, Chitra Devakurni Banerjee.
Okay, we are starting with the introduction.
You can
Should I send the link
on
again
our
on
Facebook
email?
page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Our official radio partner is Red FM.
We sent it to
Our
me
session
also,
today on
Jail
JLF
by
Brave New World is the Great March Barkha Dutt in conversation with Pragya Tiwari. As millions of Indian citizens trudge home, braving every obstacle with courage and fortitude, Barkha Dutt examines her heartbreaking journey and the societal and administrative lapses that set the stage for this tragic march. Barkha Dutt is an award-winning TV journalist, anchor, and columnist with more than 2 decades of reporting experience. She has won numerous awards, including India's premier civilian award, the Padma Shri. She is the founder editor of Mojo Story, a multimedia events and content venture. Pragya Tiwari is a journalist who has written extensively on politics, identity, policy, and culture, and edited publications including Tehelka, The Big Indian Picture, and Vice. She currently works as a policy and culture consultant. Please do remember to comment and ask questions by typing it into the comment section. And in case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Before I start, I just wanted to have a special welcome to Pragya. Pragya, I think, started this particular series. She was on, I think, the first or the second series, 59 episodes ago. It was just a fledgling new enterprise, JLF's Brave New World, to address the issue of, in these times where there is lockdown in every city, village, town, condominium, is sort of not allowing people in or out. We just felt that it was very important to allow for the free flow of knowledge and scientific information. And that's how JLF's Brave New World was born. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Pragya Tiwari.
Thank you so much, Sanjay, and welcome all of you who are watching us on this platform. Like Sanjay said, I was on the very first JLF online thing that has been launched, and I am very happy to be back 59 episodes later. What is really special about this episode is that while I was trying to piece my thoughts about what it is that I would want to speak with Barkha about, who is, of course, a colleague and a friend, it occurred to me that her journey essentially has threaded through all the various dimensions and aspects of what we've been going through over the last 3 months. And unlike any sort of severe crisis that this country has faced, we today find ourselves in a position where each dimension of the crisis is extremely dire, and each dimension, though linked with the other, is very much separate and by itself. So, it kind of gives one the daunting breadth of, gives one a sight of the daunting breadth of issues that one could possibly cover. And of course, while we wait for Barkha, we're waiting for her to join. She is possibly on one of her many reporting stints, and as she has been, she's been on the road for days on end. She's covered more than 16,000 kilometers, and she's probably somewhere where she's struggling to get online because, as you know, internet is patchy in different places.
But Pragya, while we wait for her to come on, let me ask you a question about the present scenario. You know, we've had 60 days of lockdown and a pretty stringent one, and then we had the Wuhan moment where workers, daily wage workers, decided to leave the city and go back home, and of course, with taking with them some of the virus that sort of accompanied them. But how do you see this? We had 60 days to prepare, and yet now Um, of course, we knew that the curve wouldn't be flattened. But now what we are saying is those 60 days wasn't enough, and it's such a crisis. What's your sense of it? And welcome, Barkha, from wherever you are.
I'm
It's
so sorry.
incredible to have you on, and congratulations for your 70 days on the road. You are not just a hero, but you really brought alive the tragedy, captured the tragedy that India is facing presently. And I don't think people still understand just the extent of what's been happening. But I'm going to ask Pragya to answer, and then I'm going to leave it to both of you.
So
Pragya.
very quickly, I think the focus of this conversation is Barkha now that she's with us. But I don't think 60 days was not enough. I think there's a lot that could have been done, but absolutely nothing was done. And of course, there are statewide discrepancies. Bombay and Maharashtra, even though they've managed to do some groundwork. Delhi hasn't. Chhattisgarh has, Kerala hasn't. So there are statewide discrepancies in what has happened and what has not happened. But it is not fair to say the 60 days were not enough. I just feel like there were, of course, the magnitude of the challenge was enormous because there were so many dimensions. Like I was earlier saying, we had to provide welfare, safety nets for the poor. We had to take care of the economy. We had to build a public health system which doesn't even exist. India's spending on public health is absolutely abysmal. I think it's 1.6%, which is lower than any country in its grade. Let's not compare it to Western or first world countries at all. So there were multiple dimensions. But even if we had addressed the problems at hand with decent and good policy making, 20%, 30% of the way, we would not have been where we are today. So we definitely need to call out the people who were responsible for handling this crisis. And did not, which brings me to Barkha, who's been doing such a great job of doing that by not just raising issues, but also giving us sort of the human aspect of those issues that help us really identify and get the scale of tragedy. And more importantly, they help us not to look away, which I think is the great need of this moment. So, welcome, Barkha. Thank you for joining us. Like I was saying before you came, I'm sure you are somewhere in the wilderness reporting as you always are. So I'm glad that you could join, and I'm glad that your internet worked. But Barkha, what I'm going to do is, like I was saying before, that there are, when I was trying to put my thoughts together of what I want to talk to you about, I realized that your journey threads this entire, sort of the many-dimensional, multi-dimensional tragedy that we find ourselves in. Too. So I don't know if we can do that justice in 35 minutes, but I will start by asking you, what prompted this journey? I mean, did you really think when you started out that it's going to end up being 16,000 kilometers in 70 days?
So firstly, now from 70 days, I'm on my 88th day. So we've actually moved
Cannot keep up.
Cannot keep up. Even I can barely keep up. Everything feels like a blur. No, Pragya, when this started, I had no idea. If you had asked me then, would I be traveling across the country? Would I manage to even reach from Delhi to Bombay, leave alone Kerala or Karnataka? I would have said it's not possible. It wasn't even part of the plan. There was no roadmap. There was no route. How it started was, I remember the lockdown was declared at 8 p.m. to be implemented from midnight. And I got up the next morning and I said, the media is a listed exempt essential service. So let me step out and see what's happening. And it started with me going to the borders of the capital. And suddenly I saw two things. One, I saw that there was no Indian state present. And what I mean by that is there wasn't even a policeman. There wasn't even a constable. There was just nobody. It was an expanse. It was like the borders had opened up and there was no one to man them. And they were just men, women, and children walking across these borders. And I quickly understood that something unusual, tragic is about to happen. And for the next 72 hours, I kept going back to every border state around the capital. And I would keep seeing the same thing. And I would see literally nobody but these men, women, and children and myself. I didn't see any other journalists either. I didn't see police officers. I didn't see bureaucrats. I saw nobody. And then I understood that I didn't know it would be the largest exodus of human beings since the partition of India. But I understood that something gigantic was unfolding before me. And I needed to be out there talking to people to understand it And, that's how it started. It started with me just following the highways to see where our workers were walking. And what started with that then became this almost accidental, unplanned, zigzag road trip through the heart of India, which is still ongoing. And that's when I understood that, it would be the greatest abdication. The Indian state abdicated. Uh, the Indian big media came very close to abdicating. And I understood that it would be an absolute abdication for me as a journalist if I didn't go out and tell this story.
So what you're talking about essentially is what is the foundation of journalism, right? The reporter's instinct and the reporter's responsibility, right? And that, while that remains the core of journalism, the medium has changed and taken so many different avatars. You were there when television journalism changed forever in this country. I'm very curious about what your experience of this shift, and of course it's not new for you. Mojo's been around for a while, but this is really extensive. What you've done in the last 70, 80 days is just, it is unprecedented, even with digital video and audio, right? So what has been, how different is reporting for both mediums? The pros and the cons. How large is your setup? I'm very curious to know what this Barkha 2.0 is learning about journalism.
So I think what I've learned in this phase is that I had forgotten who I was. Uh, there was I was a first generation television journalist. Unlike many other contemporaries, I did not move from a newspaper to television. I did my master's in film and television production and became a television journalist as TV News was born in this country. And what I loved about it was to go out there and tell a powerful story. And I think over the years, though I always identified as a reporter and not as a television anchor, maybe I lost a bit of myself somewhere. Like maybe I became that person in those boxes interviewing the same party spokespeople every night because it was lazy, it was easy, it was cheap, it was boring, but it got the job done. And I think Barkha 2.0 basically discovered how much she missed Barkha 1.0. And I think I'd lost myself somewhere along the way. And to that extent, I think TV lost itself somewhere along the way. Television started with this great, powerful instrument of visual storytelling, of scale, of giving voice to people who did not have a voice, of immediacy, of urgency. And somewhere, many reasons, revenue models broken, capture of media by government, propagandists, polarization, all of that, many different reasons. No money, newsrooms getting depleted, advertising rating games, so many different reasons, the move to digital content. Television broke as a model. And with that, I think the power of storytelling just died in TV. So for me, other than rediscovering my old self, what are the pros and cons? The pros are quite simply that while channels are possibly worrying about whether they have the money to finance an all India trip of the kind that I've undertaken, the fact that I'm an 8-member organization makes my capital costs much less than someone who's running a big mammoth organization. Technology, we're here. I'm talking to you. We're on Zoom. The world is watching, I hope. Can you ever do away with this now? Are you really going to buy OB-Vans and big cameras and big satellite hookups when you basically know that a good broadband connection is all that you actually need to have reasonable quality conversations? But television, had invested in all of that. So I think technology has democratized the ability for many different journalists to actually become entrepreneurs and no longer remain employees. So that is a big pro. I think some of us had outgrown our identities as employees. We were searching to have a little corner of the sky for ourselves, however tiny it is. And I think technology has allowed that. I think the one thing that is common to digital and TV is the visual power of a good story, right? The tactile sense of a person, her tragedy, her hope, her despair, seeing it, feeling it. I think TV started dying because it forgot to tell stories. And Mia culpa, I already said I was probably part of that little drift, right? So for me, I may have moved from TV to digital, but I'm essentially doing the same thing that I like to do, which is to take a set of visuals, to take a set of characters and give voice to their story. The cons are obvious, I don't have the scale uh, that television has. I thought it would matter a lot till I discovered it doesn't matter that much because actually impact is different from volume. And I think that has been the biggest lesson of this journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And for you, if I may say so, it's not just a return to Barkha 1.0, it's also a return to your legacy, given what a fantastic reporter your mother was and how she had an amazing reporter's instinct. I mean, she's somebody I discovered later on my journey as a journalist, and I've been fascinated by her. And I really hope, because you've really set an example for what the potential of digital is. So I really hope that you can, and I'm sure if anybody can do it, it's you, find a sustainable financial model to take this forward and really transform what media is. But Barkha, I just also want to, I'm very curious, I've been a reporter, we've all been on the road, and at the best of times, being a woman, being on the road reporting is bloody tough. Like a common friend of ours, Sunetra, had written about how sometimes it's just reduced to the search for a clean toilet. Now imagine doing this during a lockdown where you don't know if you'll get through borders, you don't know if you'll get through the next checkpoint, you don't know where you're going to find your next meal. Just give us a sense of what the journey has been like for you.
So I think that we have to first acknowledge that our public spaces are not made for women. They're made for men. Our bathrooms are not made for women. They're made for men. If you want to use a bathroom, you have to use it at a petrol pump. It's filthy. It's filled with roaches. There are 100 men around. Luckily for me, I had a masterclass in being able to report the Kargil War in 1999, where one of the reasons originally given to me as a reason to deny me permission to go to the front was exactly the absence of bathrooms. One of the generals at that time had said, "How will we manage? There are no bathrooms. There are no places to sleep." I think because I was baptized by fire, literally, I grew up. I had that early exposure to the fact that you do have to take a bottle and go and wash yourself in the mountains. If you get your period in the middle of the war or in the middle of covering a pandemic, and both happened to me, and you can run out of sanitary pads, you do have to use tissues instead. You do have to stop being squeamish. You have to stop whispering about it. You have to be able to tell your male cameraman you need to take a leak. You have to say you need to go behind the tire. Can you cover for me? You also reach a point when you don't care which truck driver sees you. I've pulled down my salwar and pulled up my shirt and just, if you have to go. You become like you just get used to it. But yes, I do have a team traveling with me. I have a young producer who's 21 traveling with me. She's never seen anything like this before. She thinks I'm absolutely crazy. Um, and everybody comes from a different exposure, a different set of protections. It's difficult for women to suddenly adjust to the fact that the public expanse is to be treated as, don't care who's watching, don't care who's looking. The toughest part of this journey, apart from logistical things like that, sometimes has been food. It's got a lot easier now because we're in unlock 1 or whatever. But when we first started, the dhabas were closed. You could pack your poha or your sandwiches for 8 hours, whatever. But after that, there was no food, and you were begging owners at dhabas to serve you illegally. You would sometimes go and hide behind a shack, and they'd say, "Dikhna nahi chahiye. No one should see that you're eating here. The police will come and beat us up," right? And one of my big problems with this lockdown is that unlike everywhere else in the world, we shut down public transport even for essential services. We made this a draconian police-driven curfew-oriented lockdown instead of just a way of, trying to not gather crowds and prepare the health system. So it was tough to get food in the beginning. It was very tough to get clean places to sleep at. You were sometimes asking friends of friends. You were often calling district magistrates whom you didn't know. It helped that I'm an old woman who's been around for almost 30 years now. I could say, "I'm so and so. Can you please help? I don't have a place to stay." Sometimes they just get you a guest house. Sometimes they get you a hotel. The hotel would tell you there's no food. You had Maggie, you had cup of noodles. So you had nights like that. We had many nights like that. But we were driven by really the kindness of people. As somebody who's been trolled viciously, I'm staggered by how much kindness I've seen in the last 3 months. My shoes broke and shoe companies were offering free shoes. My car broke down and strangers were offering cars. I would drive through a place and people would say, do you need a place to stay? And we called upon those strangers at times. We actually, I have picked up from Twitter writing to someone saying, you said you had a place to stay here. Can you connect me to so and so? I've stayed in a khet in Udaipur because somebody connected me to somebody who connected me to somebody, where there was one, housekeeper who gave us one roti and bhindi. So all of that has happened, and it has been made possible by the kindness of strangers. For me personally, more than the bathrooms, more than the lack of, because I've been in tough situations before, I found myself rattled by having to wear PPE. Um, I found myself almost wimpish. The only time that we did wear it, and it's been a few times now, is when we would step inside COVID hospitals and meet COVID positive patients and we would carry our own PPE bought from Defense Colony Chemists at the back of the dicky of our car because we didn't want to be infringing on hospitals that have short supplies of them. But it is the closest feeling to strangulation that you can possibly imagine. And I used to think that this was just me till I interviewed nurses at Mumbai's Kama Hospital who spoke about getting palpitations, who spoke about choking, who spoke about the smell of plastic, who spoke about their children refusing to touch them because they smelt of something odd. And I understood that there were chemical fumes from this thing, that it did actually stop your oxygen supply in an effort to keep you safe. So oddly, if you had to ask me, oh my God, what was that one tough thing that you couldn't do? I mean, I did it, but I literally felt sick every time I did it.
It would be absolutely criminal for you not to write your memoir. God knows I'm looking forward to that. But Barkha, let's come to the story itself that you've been telling. I'm going to start with, it's very quickly before we move on to the health crisis that we're in the middle of. We started with a focus on the migrant. That's how your storytelling started, the migrant exodus, right? Then we had trains and we had migrants dying on those trains. We had that image of that woman who lay dead on a platform, whose child was trying to wake her up. And suddenly we find ourselves in a place where the focus is entirely shifted from the migrant crisis. This could partly be because a lot of migrants are now on their way home or back home, or it could also be because we're in the middle of a new, bigger crisis where we're seeing no hospital beds, people dying, etc., etc. I want to stay with the migrant story. Where is that at this point in time? And are we being short-sighted in not kind of keeping an eye on what happens when these migrants get back to rural India, not just in terms of the infection rising in places where there's just absolutely, the state is absent, the public health system is absent, but also that the starvation might continue, the crisis of the economy might continue where they're concerned. So just your thoughts on that before we move on to the health crisis.
So I think it's so interesting that there's one common thread that ties together the two phases of this story. The first was the migrant crisis. The second is the medical crisis, as you called it. What ties it together, tragically, is the abdication of the Indian state. The state was invisible and not present when the workers, 45 million of them, walked our highways, highway after highway. The state is absent at the hospitals. I have spent the last many days at hospital after hospital, in city after city, at graveyards, at crematoriums. There is not a single human being present to talk to people, who have lost people, who are being told by not even the hospital administrator, but by a security guard, please leave from here, there's no bed. No bed is a misnomer. There are enough beds. There are just not enough health workers. There are just not enough oxygen tanks. There are not enough ventilators, right? But that ends up being the shorthand of no bed. And you literally find that because there are very few journalists as well at these gates, literally nobody actually, I find that people are asking me, where should we go? And I don't have any answers for them. People are asking me, will I live? And I don't have any answers from them. I saw today an ambulance sit in a hospital compound for 45 minutes before a doctor stepped out to address the patient. The patient was 80 years old, and the patient was then told, please go to a different hospital. And while this is not my role as a journalist, I found myself dragged into this argument because I didn't know what else to do. So the common thread as I see it, there are three phases to this story. There was the humanitarian crisis, and we're still reeling under it. And that was manifested by those images of our workers often walking through the desolation of nights like this one, because it was too hot to walk in the day. Then there is the medical crisis. And you're absolutely right that The crisis that's still waiting to erupt in our faces is what happens when these men and women get back home. And as a matter of fact, the next phase of my journey, having spent a week and 10 days now focusing on hospitals, is to travel to Bihar, to travel to parts of UP, to Jharkhand, to see what's happened as these workers have come back home. And there are two, three things to worry about. There is the economic hardship. There is social rupture. Will they be welcomed back or will they be treated as pariahs? And there is monitoring the possible movement of the virus. As these people move, did the virus move with them? And what will happen if this virus actually spreads from our cities into our rural spaces? If our cities are not able to cope, what will happen in our villages? So you're absolutely right that I think we're being short-sighted. I think the workers' story has not told itself fully. I think its last chapters are waiting to be chronicled and could bring home not just economic tragedy for the workers themselves, but also for the state of India's economy. And I remember one of the reports that I did, I was walking with these cement workers and I saw this horrible sight of them chasing after every truck they would see on the highway, begging with folded hands to be given a spot at the back of the truck. And the truck driver would invariably say, no, the police will scold me, so I can't. And I asked them, will you come back? And they said, not over our dead bodies. We're never coming back. And I remember saying during that report that if this doesn't disturb your conscience, let it at least disturb the business person in you, because your factories are not going to open if these workers don't come back. And now you have the chambers of commerce, saying, oh, bring the workers back. How are you going to bring the workers back? So there's a lot of this story left to be told.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad that you'll be telling it. But I want to, before we move on to the medical crisis, Barkha, I want to kind of, because you've traveled across the country, this is a nuance that often gets left behind when we tell large stories such as this one, which is statewide discrepancies, right? There's been a response from Kerala, which is the kind of state that you expect to do well when it comes to HDI, when it comes to human development indicators. But there's also been a great response from a state like Chhattisgarh, which is, sort of seen as this poor, laggard kind of a state. And then you have states such as Gujarat. And again, not making this political, because a lot of this is not just, it is about political leadership, but it is also, of course, about state machinery, right? Then you've seen which have been hailed for its model completely buckling under. What are your thoughts on, and what have been your observations about the kind of discrepancies between states and how all of this is being handled?
That's such an interesting question because, I found, yes, with the exception of Chhattisgarh and even Jharkhand, actually, where you've seen very proactive chief ministers. I thought Hemant Soren was very actively involved in trying to get his workers back. And I found it quite interesting how he was so personally moved when the Oraya accident happened and, the workers who were alive were placed on the same truck as the ones carrying the bodies, and the bodies were in plastic packets placed on ice, and the workers were asked to lift the bodies because the police refused to. And Soren said, these are my people, and you can't do this. So you've seen smaller, poorer states like Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand actually respond with a reasonable degree of proactive compassion. And on the other hand, you've seen, and I'm making some political statements here, but contrary to expectations, I have some praise for many of the BJP states as well. So this is really not, I don't give a shit about which political party is what. I'm just calling this out as I see it. I thought Nitish Kumar was extraordinarily disappointing for refusing to take back his people, for wanting to shut his states. No other chief minister in any party did that. Nobody did it. A very, very efficient state was Karnataka, and it really, I felt as I traveled north to south that state responses got better. I felt that the district level responses of Karnataka were very good. There was a great efficiency in how the district administrations were able to respond. I remember being in Dharwar, and the collector there had done just two small things. She had taken the hostels of the area and converted them into shelters overnight for migrant workers. And then she asked the local Khadi Gram Udyog to make them clothes. And I just thought, that's the kind of thoughtful detail that you would not expect in a crisis, but she had done it. And therefore, you did not see the kind of, this mass highway walk, the long march out of Karnataka in the way that you saw, out of a number of the other states. Kerala, again, of course, sort of years of investment in the public health system. But more than that, once again, local units of governance working. And I discovered this in Kerala. Uh, if a Keralite wants to go back home, you will be encouraged to be in room quarantine, as they call it. Not home quarantine, but room quarantine, which means that your room is your home for 14 days. But before you're given the go-ahead to come back home, a local panchayat member will go to your room and your bathroom and given all clear as to whether it is good enough for you to come back home. For me, it is unimaginable being a Delhi Valley that there can be that level of micro governance. And I think that level of micro governance is what we saw in Kerala and Karnataka. I think in Chhattisgarh, we saw starting early. I think what Chhattisgarh did was start in January. And I think the fact that they did not wait for this crisis to erupt in their face before they started responding to it really did serve them well.
I think the big lesson from what you're saying is if we could just have a greater level of decentralization, we might not have been here. But now I must come, lest we run out of time, to the big crisis of the moment, which is the medical crisis that we are in the midst of. You wrote a fantastic column in Hindustan Times yesterday, which was not just focused on the tragedy as it is playing out, but what can be done over the next couple of weeks for us to emerge out of this crisis. I'm going to ask you a very large question in 3 parts. One is, why were we so utterly unprepared despite the long lockdown period that we had to prepare? Secondly, how dire is the situation right now? And third, what can we do to save lives in this very moment going forward? Because the disease is still, it's yet to peak. So there's still time.
So let me take the first question. Why are we so unprepared? This lockdown, in the way that it was executed, has been a mistake, a colossal mistake, and it has been actually wasteful, because there was only one thing that could have justified this lockdown, and that was to prepare our health systems. And now that we find that our health systems are woefully underprepared, we did not use this lockdown as we were meant to. And in fact, this lockdown triggered as I said, a gigantic humanitarian crisis, whereupon worker told me that poverty will kill me before the virus will. I remember meeting the 9-year-old son of a migrant worker as he was leaving from Bhiwandi, the textile town of Maharashtra, to his village in Uttar Pradesh. And I playfully asked him, what, aapko malum hai coronavirus kya hai? Do you know what the coronavirus is? And he said, haan, bilkul, of course I know. And I said, what is it? And he said, it means I don't get food. And that is what his understanding of the virus, of the pandemic was. I thought that 3 months of reportage had been succinctly captured by a child in one sentence, that is what effectively we did to our poor. We made the poor pay for keeping our class safe. I remember a domestic help worker in Mumbai telling me after being sacked from the high-rise apartments she used to cook in, the virus came in on an aeroplane, brought in by the rich, and it's the poor who are on the street, on foot, and on bicycle. And I think that's what the unfairness of the lockdown did. The second thing the lockdown got wrong was the idea of social distancing in India. In a country where 92 million households live in one room, where in Dharavi, 8,000 bathrooms commonly are used for 8 lakh people. When you tell people to stay at home, you're actually making them more unsafe. We did not think this through. It was not a detailed execution. We were non-specific in our lockdown, and we are being non-specific in the way we are lifting it. There is not enough attention being paid to detail. And the reason we locked down was to prepare our health system. So why are we here? I think we're here because the fatalities maybe lulled our governments into a kind of complacency that the worst is over, and that even if people are testing positive, we're not dying at the rates that other countries are dying from. And I hope that remains true, because that is largely true that we're an outlier in terms of the number of fatalities. But I think that the lack of coordination between the central government and chief ministers, I think over centralization when it was not needed, and too much centralization sometimes, let every state decide on its own flight entries. A country can't run like that. You can't have airlines open and then say, let every state decide its own. But every state should be able to decide which districts it wants to put in what colored zone, right? So I think not knowing when to centralize, not knowing when to decentralize was a big mistake. Now, you said, where are we now? I worry that where we are now is that we have created, our messaging has been poor. We have created stigma around testing positive. So what is happening is, and panic and hysteria around testing positive. So what is happening is the rush for hospitals. Maybe everybody doesn't need to be in hospital, but there is such a sense that if I stay at home and I'm positive, my neighbors will shun me. There'll be stickers on my door. I'll be talked about. I'll be ostracized. God knows, maybe I'll be pelted with stones. And I think this panic, and I think maybe even mildly impacted people therefore make a rush rush for hospitals. So stigma is a problem. The third huge crisis, we have enough beds. We have enough beds. We really do. I've done the data count. We have enough beds. What we do lack is healthcare workers. Our ward staff is not showing up. Our cleaners are not showing up. Our nurses are running short. So we have to have a centralized plan where we identify the worst hit cities and we requisition health workers from other cities. We have reached the moment when we need to requisition non-medical volunteers and train them on the job. So we cannot do with qualified medical practitioners anymore. The time has come to seek volunteers. And in fact, in Mumbai, one of the large jumbo facilities at the Dome, which used to be this rock concert venue, which has now been very successfully converted into a modular hospital, they are appealing for volunteers, even college students, come and help. We are going to have to take medicine to people instead of people to hospitals. We're going to have to find the science to put ICUs on wheels, to put oxygen cylinders on wheels, because the way our hospitals are responding with the shortage of staff, we are away from the peak. We're going to see a flood otherwise at our hospitals. We need human beings to talk to people at hospitals. That abdication of the state that I was talking about, it's playing out at our hospitals. We don't have representation. Nobody to talk to people. And we need to figure out our testing. We've got terrified of testing because, as an Aam Aadmi Party leader was telling me earlier this evening, it's become a measure of it's become a political index. Oh, Delhi and Maharashtra are doing terribly. Their governments, therefore, are terrible. Kerala and Karnataka are doing well, therefore their governments are. So what's happened is that every chief minister is looking over her or his shoulder and not wanting to test because a spike in cases is seen as political failure right now or governance failure. And we've just got to find a way, Pragya, to take the politics out of this. I've never felt, I used to be a political journalist. I've never felt this distant from the party politics of this country as I do today. And I suspect that I speak for most Indians when I feel like that.
I couldn't agree more. I don't have much time left with you, but I am going to ask you a slightly personal question as my last question, which is that watching some of your reports have literally made me cry. They've given me sleepless nights. How are you doing? How are you dealing with the distress? How are you coping with this immeasurable tragedy that you are thrusting yourself in the middle of in order to be able to tell stories?
The honest answer, and I think I owe people listening, the honest answer is that I don't think I'm doing well. I preserve my even keel for the 5 minutes I get with a worker, with a victim, with a body sometimes, at a crematorium, at a graveyard. I know that my experience compels me to show that training in this moment and not betray that brittleness in the report. I don't always succeed. Sometimes that brittleness creeps into the report as well, but I try very hard to keep the even keel in the report. I think I am vastly depleted on even keel otherwise. I'm not able to sleep. I cry easily. I lose my temper more easily. I sometimes laugh more easily as well. I have no idea why I laugh, but every emotion feels heightened. I feel guilty at times because I'm aware of my privilege. I know I walk into these homes where people have sometimes killed themselves, have died, have no food. I met a 26-year-old who has stage 3 cancer and she lived in one room and she said, can you take me to hospital? I can't, with all my influence, I can't find her a hospital. And I come back to my house and, well, I don't come back to my house now, but even when I don't come back to my house and I'm on the road, I can't pay for a meal. I can't pay for a good hotel if a hotel is willing to take me in. And so there's dissonance, there's guilt. I know that I it's not rational. My job has to be to tell a good story. But there are all kinds of contradictory things you take back, you get damaged. You're no good for talking to other people who live in your life outside the circumference of the story. You suddenly can't talk to, your father, your sister, your partner in the way that you used to, because actually you have very little to say apart from this. So there are all kinds of ripples that you take into your life, and they're not living that reality, so they don't get it. So no, it's not easy.
Yeah, well, I can understand everything else, but guilt is not something you should be feeling. God knows. God knows you're paying a huge personal cost to be able to do something that I feel like all of us, I mean, I should be feeling the guilt that we're, even as journalists, putting out just Twitter messages to you saying, well done, Barkha, excellently done, but I wish more of us were on the road shouldering your burden. But until then, prayers for you and love for you. I am going to take some questions from the audience. I will start with B. Hello, B, if you're still listening to us. She says, thank you, Barkha, for your hard work, highlighting the stories of the most vulnerable. Do you think public perceptions of journalists can change to a less antagonistic setting?
I think so, actually. Um, I think it started with people wondering what happened to television. Because newspapers, at least some of them, the city papers, did go out. Stringers in small towns did go out. Photographers did go out. The medium, the industry that did not go out was television. And I think that people across ideologies responded with humaneness to the people who went out. And because there were such few people who went out, I found that the people who troll me normally, uh, so many of them, they want to preface their message with saying, oh, irrespective of your ideology, we want to tell you you've done a great job. And I don't want to discuss right now their assumptions about my ideology, but that they say it. I think this is an inflection point, and something new can come from this. It's a oddly empowering time to be a journalist if you decide that you want to actually go out and give voice to people. And I think people have felt for so long that nobody speaks for people, that I think B is right. Something could come out of this. I'm hopeful.
There's a question from Modit Jain, who asks, in your experience, what do you think were the main thoughts in the minds of the laborers trudging home? And I think it's an important question because it's, in order for us to be able to stomach what we are seeing, we sometimes tend to dehumanize those people, but they're really just us. I would be very interested to know what were the kinds of thoughts that were going through their minds.
So I think the assumption that our class made was that because people are poor, they don't have emotion. And therefore, none of their decisions would be guided by the emotions that guide our decisions. So we understood when people stranded in Dubai and, Amsterdam wanted to come home. We understood that because that's what we'd feel. But we didn't understand why someone who earned 200 rupees a day would have that emotion also. So the first discovery, I think, was that poverty doesn't eliminate psychology. The psychological need for security is a very deep one. And the number of times people said to me, agar marna hai to ghar jaake marenge. If we have to die, rather die at home. The thoughts, I saw the emotion shift. It began with panic when the exodus first started. It moved to despair and fear. There was a lot of police violence involved as these workers tried to cross borders because on paper they were still violating government orders as they tried to move. So they were beaten. They sometimes had to pay bribe. They had to implore people in uniform to let them pass. And I then watched, then there was fatalism. We have to die. Let us die at home. Let us die with our children. And then there was rage, just unadulterated rage about the people. I mean, I remember people saying no one even called to see if we were alive, right? No, my sage didn't even make a phone call to see if I'm okay. And as I told you, the domestic worker who said, what justice is this? You guys brought the virus on your fancy planes and we're paying the price for you. And I think today we've seen those workers, domestic help saying, why doesn't the Mem Sahab first prove that she's corona free before she asks me to prove it, right? So I saw this I saw these graded shifts in emotions, but mostly I think people worried for their children. I can never get over it's in fact my pinned tweet, the story that I've not taken down from Twitter. It was about 1 in the morning and I heard a child crying and I ran to see what was happening and I saw this small group of workers walking through forest land and the child was hungry. And of course we gave the child the biscuits and water we had, but the child was hungry and I was like, where are you going? And they said, we're going to Gorakhpur. It was 1,000 kilometers away from where they were. And I was like, what are you doing? Why are you walking? Because the trains theoretically had started by then. And they said, we can't wait. There was such a sense of deep displacement, emotional, physical, economic, social, that they were willing to walk through the desolation of that night with the children crying than wait in a system that they felt had orphaned them. And then the final insult to injury, we made them pay for their train tickets, for their spots in these trucks. And then we said we're sending them home free. We basically lied. So, I mean, I just think that at every stage, it's like talking to a child without parents. The child is sad, then the child is fatalistic. Sometimes the child is bitter. Then the child says, you know what, I have to survive. And then it becomes about survival. And I think right now they're just about, we have to survive.
Related question from Rajta Akhilesh Chauhan is, with the way urban India has treated them, do you think that the daily wage laborer would even want to return? Has this broken the romance of the city dreams? Will they have a choice? You touched upon this a little bit, but I think the scope of this question is broader.
So I think it's going to depend, unfortunately, on how bad it is when they get back. What I worry about, and I have not yet reported the third phase of the story, but I'm going to in the next 10, 15 days, is there a sense of belonging when you go back? Or are you treated like a pariah in your village? Is there social ostracism? Is there any economic opportunity? So far, every worker has said to me that we're not coming back. I haven't met a worker who's coming back, statedly. Now, you could argue that a few months will pass, penury will drive them back to the city. I know factory owners, some of them are my friends, who have been calling them and saying, we'll pay you a little more, please come back. I don't know if that will maybe make them reconsider. But at the moment, the city is the aspiration. I mean, even for all of us, right? Like, we know, actually, if we're vulnerable to this pandemic, it's most so in our cities.
Yeah. There is a question from Pooja Sodhi. What is your take on the rates being published by hospitals? My guess is that she's referring to that max rate card that we all saw from Delhi. At these rates, even middle class will struggle to get adequate care. What should be done to make it accessible to everyone? I think I'll broaden the question a bit and get your thoughts on private health system regulation, which has again been a huge issue in this country and has just been exacerbated by this tragedy.
So there's no question that young doctors in their 20-somethings, the residents or public hospitals are carrying the cross almost single-handedly for this fight. Private hospitals in our big cities are often fudging capacity. They're saying they're at 100% capacity when they're actually performing at between 20 to 40% capacity. I interviewed Abhay Soy, the man who owns Max, just this evening. I'll be releasing that soon because I was so agitated at everything I've seen at the hospitals, not just that rate card, but everything I've personally seen at hospitals. And he didn't agree with me naturally, but I do feel that it's crazy. Cities that haven't capped fees, absolutely crazy. The state needs to enlist private hospitals at this point and pay them at cost. I also think that it's not fair to ask private hospitals to, for example, finance modular facilities. Some owners of private hospitals have told me that chief ministers have called them and said, hey, why don't you set up this jumbo hospital and you pay for it? Why? I mean, this lockdown was meant to be for the Indian state to step in and prepare the healthcare system. And you have every right to tell private hospitals that you cannot profit here. But you can't expect them to replace the state. They can't replace the state. We didn't elect them. We elected you, right? So you've got to perform. Pay the private hospitals, agree on an aggregated minimal cost. My suggestion is ask a public hospital, what does it cost to treat a patient in an oxygenated bed? Make that the standardized cost across the country. Ask the private hospitals that they can charge no more than that, right? And that's the minimum you need to do. But I think we're already at the maximum. I think we need to nationalize private hospitals for the length of this pandemic. There's no other way this is going to happen. We're going to keep negotiating and we do not have the time to negotiate.
Well, let's hope the powers that be are listening. Absolutely. Last question that I have time for. Om Prakash Parikh asked, how can we help those who return to their villages since there's no jobs or income? Is it going to be a greater human tragedy than even the virus since since you've had direct contact with these migrants? So some of this you've already answered, Barkha, and you will be covering the story, like you said, at length in the coming weeks. I'm going to broaden the ambit of this question and ask you, as private citizens, those who are listening, all of us, what can we still do beyond maybe some donations that people have been making here and there to help the state along?
The first thing is that you have to pay your staff. Find a way to not sack anyone right now, even if even if it pinches your pockets. I know that's easier said than done. It's not that being middle class, doesn't come with its own burdens. But if you can cut back on something else and try and not remove anyone from a job right now, try and pay your drivers and your help. Unfortunately, I have seen too many people not doing that. Right. Secondly, don't romanticize hardship. This is, I cannot, nothing has made me angrier than the way the story of the 15-year-old girl who cycled to Bihar with her father sitting at the back of her. You're offering a cycling federation trials. I mean, are we crazy? She's a little child who spent 8 days without food and water getting her father back to Bihar, and we think this is some great achievement. She should never have had to do that, right? So I think we need to show a little more respect for what people have gone through, a little more awareness of our own privilege. But okay, that seems like a moral science class, and we're all bad at dealing with our elitism, so we'll all deal with it in our personal ways. For me, I think if we can commit ourselves to feeding maybe 4 people outside of the people we know, in whatever way that's comfortable, I think small helps. Forget these big plans, these big donations, these big NGOs. I saw something very moving in Surat, where every housing society said, if I eat 2 rotis for lunch, I'll make 4, and I'll make 5 more. And they called it the Panch Roti drive. And they would just make 5 more rotis than whatever they were making. They would make sure that it would get to a camp that was feeding people. And it just seems so small, but everybody can do it. Everybody can have 5 extra rotis made in their home, right? And the last, I cannot emphasize this enough, the stigma, the paranoia, the fear of COVID positive patients. You do not, I am not a doctor, but I'm saying this with all the medical knowledge I have garnered over the last 3 months. Sitting in a park with somebody on the other bench who, even if that person is COVID positive, you are not going to contract it. Wear your mask. That person is wearing your mask. This virus isn't going anywhere. You can't hide in your homes. You have to find precautionary ways to live with it and not judge people who are COVID positive. This is reminiscent of HIV/AIDS in the 80s. We are creating, instead of treating people as patients, we are treating them as criminals. And this is going to cause a kind of social rupture that we're not even prepared for.
Excellent, Barkha. I wish we had more time, but I think I've run out of time, and everyone at JLF has been very patient with me. So I am going to hand over to Sanjoy. Before I do, thank you so much for everything you're doing, and thank you for talking to me. Much love.
Thank you, Barkha. Thank you, Pragya. Please stay on while I wrap the session. And as you said, Barkha, push back on fear, push back on stigma, feed, even if it's 2 more people or 4 more people. And by the way, Delhi has a roti project. Golf Links Defense Colony has been leading on it. Please continue to pay your staff, your drivers, your guards, and so on and so forth. And most importantly, stop romanticizing the tragedy that has unfolded. What you've done, I think, nation sort of owes you a debt for streaming these stories to us from across the country, and most strengths to you and to Team Mojo Story. And I hope you continue to bring us these tragedies, and I hope in some sense they evoke what they should evoke, embarrassment, and get us to sort of move and provide the support that government and civil society and individuals can do. Thank you both so much for being there. I'm sorry that we weren't able to take all the millions of questions that were streaming in from across the world. Perhaps we'll send them to Barkha. I know that she's like super busy on the road. She may not get time in many ways to answer them. But thank you. Share this, because I think much of what's been said has been very, very important. And thank our official radio partners, Red FM, Bajate Raho. And we hope you will all log back on at 9 p.m. for our next session, The End of the Ocean. Maja Lunde in conversation with Catherine Morris. This session is presented in partnership with the Norwegian Embassy, India. Maja Lunde's latest sci-fi novel, The End of the Ocean, explores the threat of a devastating worldwide drought witnessed through the lives of a father, a daughter, and a woman who will risk her life to save the future. The best-selling Norwegian author speaks to Catherine Morris about climate crisis and how she mirrors nature and its disruptions in her fiction. See you at 9 p.m.